Welcome to Change by Attraction, a podcast about nurturing change in your organization. I'm your host, Esther Derby. I'm going to travel back in time a little bit and tell you a story. There was a time when I was an employee, I was a dev manager, and I was sitting in my boss's office for what I thought was going to be one of our typical one-on-one meetings, where she checked her email and she looked at papers, and sometimes she took phone calls because obviously any phone call was more important than what I had to say. But this was not one of those typical meetings. This time she was laser focused on me, and it was not a good thing. I could feel my shoulders getting tight, and my hands felt cold. I could feel the blood rushing to my head and my ears burning. I heard myself stammering an explanation and then an apology, trying to get her off this rant. But she kept going. I can make sure you never, ever get a promotion in this company, she told me. And guess who controls your bonus? She tapped her chest in case there was any chance I missed her meaning. I actually wasn't entirely sure what she was so angry about. But when I asked for clarification, she said, "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Though I truly did not. What I did know was that she was trying to keep me in line. I hope you've never been in a situation like that, and I hope you never are. But situations like this are not entirely uncommon in corporate America. The most generous interpretation I can make of my boss's behavior is that she really didn't have the emotional skills to handle the situation, whatever it was, in any kind of congruent way. What she did use to deal with the situation was raw power. So today I'm going to talk about power, because power is always at play in organizations, and it's always at play in change. Now, sometimes power is treated like a dirty word. People don't really want to talk about it or even acknowledge that they have it, but it's always there. So we best learn to be aware of it and learn how to use it in a responsible way. I'm going to talk about 7 sources of power today, starting with the ones that my boss used. My former boss, I'm going to call her Patty from here on out, used threats and intimidation. This is part of the toolkit of coercive power. The extreme form, and I think the image we can all kind of relate to with coercive power, is the guy with the gun to your head saying, "Do this or I'll shoot." Compulsion doesn't have to be that blatant. It can be, if you don't do this, you won't have a job. If you don't do this, I'll find somebody who will. We don't usually see physical punishment in corporations, but there's all sorts of other kinds of punishment that get doled out to people who step out of line. It may be that you're iced out of meetings, or you don't get great assignments. You get the crappy assignments. It can be the silent treatment, or it can be taunts or humiliation, people denigrating you in front of your colleagues or in other public settings. Now, in my moral frame, there is no upside to coercive power in organizations, but there's a ton of downside. Disengagement, distrust, sometimes destruction. Sometimes people resort to sabotage when they feel under the metaphorical gun. There can be backlash. Coercion kicks in a fight, flight, or fake response. And if you rely on this sort of power, the best you can hope for is compliance, or the appearance of compliance. Coercion is truly the dark side of power. Patty also used positional power. So positional power is legitimate power that's associated with a role and with delegated authority. It may be hiring, firing, assignments, promotions, all of that sort of stuff, which exists in every organization and can be used in a responsible way. Patty, however, used her legitimate power in an illegitimate way, threatening to use her legitimate power to have control over my promotion and put things in my permanent file to intimidate me. Now, positional power can be effective when people believe the person earned their position through merit and they are using their power in a fair way. It does have some limits in that it's bounded by the scope of the role. While people will generally do what their boss tells them to do, they may not do it with much genuine enthusiasm, and they may withhold discretionary effort and creativity and just go through the motions. As with coercion, you generally get compliance. The third type of power that Patty used was power over rewards. She controlled budget, she controlled raises, she controlled bonuses within our area. And this is a super common form of power in organizations. It's sort of a blunt instrument, but it can work in the short run, at least to get people to do what they need to do to earn the bonus or get the raise. However, as Deming said, people with targets and jobs dependent upon meeting them will probably meet those targets, even if they have to destroy the enterprise to do it. People are really good at gaming targets to get their rewards. So I heard an interview a few years ago about an economist who decided that he was going to use a reward, an incentive scheme, in conjunction with potty training his son, who was a toddler. He had a slightly older daughter. She was 4 or 5, I don't remember exactly. But the reward system was that when the older child helped her little brother use the potty, she would get a quarter. So she started feeding him buckets of water. And that kid had to pee a lot, and she got lots and lots of quarters. So this is a preschooler. If she can game an incentive, you can imagine what happens with adults in organizations. Plus, there's a ton of research that says that this sort of extrinsic reward tends to diminish intrinsic reward. So people are less engaged. And once again, you end up with compliance. So far, I've talked about 3 forms of power that are pretty common in change efforts. You get the do it and I'll give you a goodie, the reward power. Do it because I told you to, which is positional power. Or do this or else, which is coercion. Most of the time, coercion is saved for that overcoming resistance phase of a change. But with all 3 of these forms of power, the best you can hope for is compliance. That people will go along to get along and to avoid punishment, to get the reward. I suspect in many organizations, that's all they hope for. But there are other sources of power that aren't so much power over as power with. These sources of power are available whether you have a position or a formal role of authority in the organization or not. And they're super useful in nurturing change. So, a 4th type of power is access to information. Now, this can be factual information, or it can be being in the know. In either case, if the information is trusted or comes from a trusted source, you can get people to change the way they think and the way they act. And you tend to get buy-in. A 5th kind of power comes from networks. Networks are super influential in shaping norms and behavior. There are lots of studies that show that the behavior that's acceptable by your social circle tends to be highly, highly predictive of how you'll behave. There are even studies that show that if the people you associate with are overweight, you are far more likely to gain weight because you're pegging your behavior to theirs. You're pegging what you eat to what they eat. So even though you may be eating less, you may still be eating too much. So there's all sorts of areas where our networks, our webs of connections, shape our behavior. When you get someone who has lots of connections and is viewed as a trusted source in an organization, you can shift things pretty quickly. Knowing a lot of people can also give you access to other people who might be helpful, who might have useful information, who might be able to make another introduction or connect you with some source of information or some resource that will be helpful to change. Both knowledge power and network power can help get things done without formal authority and way beyond your direct sphere of influence. So network power has about the same upside and downside as information power. It can be misused to build a power base, just like information can be held closely to build a power base. But if it's used effectively, you'll get buy-in. There are 2 more sources of power, and I've saved the best for last. Expertise is a form of power. When you have demonstrated knowledge and expertise, people are likely to listen to you. This can make it much more likely that people are going to accept an idea if the person who's bringing the idea forward is considered an expert and has credibility. The risk with expertise is that standing in one area may get transferred to another area where the person really has no real expertise. Like the past their prime TV star who's now giving you advice on your mortgage or telling you to buy gold. In either case, for good or ill, expert power tends to lead to engagement. If someone that you think is an expert is on board with something, you're much more likely to engage in the idea. Same is true for referent power or connection power. When people know, like, and trust someone, even from afar, they're far more likely to accept what they say. And of course, this kind of power can be misused too, to manipulate people, which means the person wasn't really trustworthy, but somehow managed to cultivate that perception. This is what cult leaders do. I've covered 7 sources of power: coercion, rewards, positional or legitimate power, information power, network power, expertise power, and referent or connection power. I believe that if people understood more about power in change and what you can accomplish with information, networks, expertise, and referent power, they would rely far less on selling, telling, and yelling, and more on trusted sources of information, activating and building networks, and cultivating expertise and relationship. And they'd get much better results. They'd get engagement. Power is always present in organizations, and power with almost always is more effective in change than power over. So turn up your observation skills and start noticing how people use power in your organization. Then notice how you use power. What are you leaving on the table? My guess is that if you're working as a change artist, you do a lot more with the last 4 kinds of power: information, network, expertise, and referent power, and leave the first 3 out of the equation. But look for opportunities on how you can use those forms of power, not to be manipulative, but to expand your influence to nurture change in your organization. You'll get a lot less pushback and a lot more change. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, share it with a friend or rate it on iTunes. That'll help other people find it. I'm going to put a link to some research on power in the show notes. Until next time.